In our last episode, we discussed how Winston Churchill launched the most controversial speech of the 1945 campaign.
The Gestapo broadcast was intended to stop the Labour Party in its tracks, but instead it raised questions about Churchill's own political judgment.
Now the campaign enters its final phase.
With Churchill touring the country, Clement Attlee and Labour quietly gaining ground before an election result that would shock the world.
This is part 2 of our series on Britain's 1945 election.
The Order of the Boot.
Welcome to this episode of Churchill, the Finest Half Hour. I'm Professor Richard Toye. With me, the Ernest Bevin to my Aniran Bevan, Dr. Warren Dockter. How are you doing, Warren?
That's fun, extremely niche humor to start out our podcast with, which is also very, I think, apropos because we are talking about the election that brought Labour into power in 1940. Now, one of the things as an American, Richard, from the outset, most Americans find this extremely odd that Winston Churchill, as we discussed last episode, could have been so loved but also then lose the 1945 election. And one of my favorite quotes that he said in September 1945, shortly after the election, "How can I accept the Order of the Garter when the people of England have just given me the Order of the Boot?"
That's right. So Churchill has just been offered by the king, sort of great honour, the Order of the Garter, one of the highest ones that you can get. So keep your fingers crossed for me.
Well, I've refused mine a couple times now.
And so, yeah, he was smarting from this election defeat. Go back to the campaign itself. We talked last time about how he'd started off on a very controversial note with the so-called Gestapo speech, but he was in an uncomfortable position. Part of his pitch, of course, was war leadership, but in fact, that was something which rubbed many people up the wrong way because he did have this reputation for aggression and sort of even for being a warmonger, and that people felt that he wasn't then appropriate necessarily as a peace leader.
I mean, one of the interesting things, of course, that the 1945 election, I think, showcases is this fundamental tension or paradox between Winston Churchill, the national leader, loved man of the hour, saved Britain in a dogged dog, versus the party leader, Churchill.
Yeah, and I think also remember that at this stage, he'd obviously achieved a great deal in his career. He'd been Chancellor of the Exchequer, he'd been Home Secretary, he'd been Prime Minister, obviously a very effective wartime Prime Minister. But what he had still not done, remember, is to win a general election as leader of the Conservative Party. So there hadn't been a general election since 1935. The elections had been suspended for the duration, and Parliament had passed an act every year saying we're going to put this for another year. And so he still had ambition. I mean, he was still a guy, the term old man in a hurry springs to mind. Of course, he wanted to bring the war itself to a successful conclusion too. And I think that must have hurt him, even though in practice after the election, the war only continued for about another 3 weeks. Sort of the fact that he wasn't there at the end to be the one announcing the peace.
I mean, in our podcast, we do stay Churchill focused, but let's zoom out a little bit and look at the historical context of the 1945 election from a political science point of view, because I think that will also help illustrate some of what happened beyond Churchillian narrative. And so I think one of the first things we have to focus on is the media landscape of 1945. This is still when radio is king.
So basically what you've got is sort of the radio where these regular election broadcasts, it wasn't only Churchill doing it, it was other party leaders, it was other high-profile figures. And on average, these were 45% of the domestic audience. And so you can pretty much think that your words, if you're one of these leaders, they're going to get across to a large number of people. They're going to be reproduced in the newspapers the following morning, and people who haven't heard them will probably overhear people at work the next day talking about them.
That's the radio. Now, a lot of people, and I think this is maybe lost on my generation and subsequent generations, but a lot of people got their news from the cinema in this time.
That's right. And before the main film, and there might often be more. You would have a newsreel package, as it was called. These are programs which have to remain good for maybe 3 weeks, actually, because they'll be shown in the high-grade cinemas first, in the slightly less good ones the next week, and in the real flea pitch the week after that. So it's not up to the minute. We're not talking 24/7 news coverage as we would have today. Obviously, they've got to be filmed, film's got to be processed, edited, etc., etc. But and then also what we don't know is really how many. We know approximately weekly audience of 20 million. Cinema. Both Churchill and Attlee do these short films. Churchill's is about 4 minutes long. I would say here you see it will help your American friends understand why Churchill didn't win, because Attlee, after the breakup of the coalition, had a little bit of a pause, and he's pretty fresh, he's snappy, he keeps it to maybe 2.5 minutes. Churchill goes on for about 4 minutes, and Churchill is clearly completely exhausted to the point where he looks like somebody who's got severe jet lag. I was probably the best way of putting it. And he reads out his speech, and it is not dynamic. He's completely shattered.
But I think another important point here is, in terms of the media, is, of course, print media, which was still very, very popular in Britain. But one of the things that I think has changed is that for a long time, the conservative news, Churchill's friends who were media barons and so forth, we've talked about, that altered by 1945 because there are increasingly labor-backing papers like the Daily Herald and the Daily Mirror who have their own readership, around 6 million readers, according to research you've done. And that's catching up with the 6.8 million that the Tory press has. And I think there's something in this as well that we talked about in the last episode, which is increasingly, after the Beveridge Report, after 1943, people see labor as a coherent, logical, they're not these evil socialists that had been imagined in the early 30s. These are people who are serious, that can run the government in a serious way.
Yeah. I mean, I would also say that maybe in comparison to today's media, I would say that the press was fair in terms of actually reporting what the other side had said. There was quality information out there for people who wanted to look for it, really.
I mean, how people consumed and got their media is so much different in 1945 than it is now.
Churchill's pitch really is very much around his personality. Above all, he goes on this huge national tour, and this is the classic reasons why people might be surprised afterwards that Churchill had lost, given that there is obviously a great deal of support for him, and he does the V sign, he's got his cigars there. I think what's really interesting, quite a few years ago now, there was a documentary by the left-wing British filmmaker Ken Loach called The Spirit of 1945. And it showed footage of this, and Churchill is being booed and hissed by the crowd. And it's like, oh my God, he wasn't like that popular. This is like a myth that's suddenly fallen apart. Well, I mean, of course, it's an interesting fact that, again, he felt able to go out into a crowd which wasn't universally enthusiastic, but also that was part and parcel of elections from the late 19th century. As a candidate, you could show your mettle by dealing with the hecklers and putting them down. It is treated as part and parcel of the game, if you like. There's give and take. I'm sure there was some genuinely hostile booing, but I think there was also an element, sort of good-natured booing as well.
Yeah. No, I'm sure that that's true. But one of the things about the tour he took, do you think he's being shown as a tired old man at the cinema, as we were saying? And on this press tour, that must have also been the case. I mean, you must be exhausted.
But I think that he was probably following Roosevelt's example the previous year, presidential election of 1944, where Roosevelt really was in terrible health, much worse health than Churchill. But meanwhile, under the radar, there's Clement Attlee being driven around in an Austin 7 for, well, not only American listeners, but anybody who isn't a car expert on the cars of the 1940s. This is the most basic car that you can buy, which is obviously an implicit counterpoint to the grandiosity of Churchill.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of bitter controversy during this election, not only about the Gestapo speech, but in trying to paint Labour as extreme and dangerous and foreign, really. And although it's not necessary to go into enormous depth on this, there is an attempt to work up a sketch about the chairman of the Labour Party, a political scientist called Harold Lasky, and to make it appear as though he's going to be pulling the strings of the Labour Party and of Clement Attlee, so that both Churchill and Attlee were going to go to the Potsdam Conference, where there were going to be big, important negotiations with President Truman and with Stalin, because this was a courtesy to Attlee, who was, because he might become prime minister, there was going to be this 3-week pause before the election results. So it was only fair to allow him to come along as an observer. And the charge which Churchill leans into heavily is that Lasky, who's a bit of a silly guy, who's got ideas above his station, is the one who's going to be pulling the strings. It really doesn't work. It just doesn't catch on.
Well, and I mean, you can see that there's diminishing returns for Churchill, too. I mean, he famously said to Lord Moran at this point that he's worried about this damned election. I have no message for them now. So I think we can explore this more after our own 3-week hiatus. No, not really. We're going to explore this more after a hiatus for our advertisers, and we'll be right back. Welcome back to Churchill, the Finest Half Hour. I'm Dr. Warren Doctor, and with me as ever is my partner in crime, the Aston Martin to my Austin 7, Professor Richard Toye.
You're very kind, but I think it's the other way around.
We were just discussing the Lasky affair and Churchill's own increasingly shaky ground during the 1945 elections. One of the things in the Lasky affair I wanted to bring out, Richard, is the fact that there was this idea that the puppet master and that Tory paper attack was led by Lord Beaverbrook. And in the previous episode, we talked about how Labour presented a picture where Lord Beaverbrook was actually the puppet master behind Winston Churchill. And I really just like the idea that you've got dueling puppets.
I mean, it does show that as today, so these claims about who's the real power behind the throne are really quite powerful. Beaverbrook, who was into stunts, really, as they would be called, sensational, outrageous claim. And of course, it was true that he was genuinely close to Churchill, who said, other people take drugs, I take Max Beaverbrook. And so having Beaverbrook on your side, pressing away in his newspapers about how great you are, isn't necessarily the great advantage you would think it is. But I think that it's worth coming to the Soviet issue, actually, at this point in foreign policy, because obviously domestic policy was something which people were heavily focused on. We've talked about Labour's policies on nationalisation, for welfare reform, etc. But there was also the question of who was going to be good from the point of view of diplomacy. And there was certainly an awareness at this time that relations with the Soviet Union in the future were going to be, enough had come out in public to know that things were going to be tense, awkward negotiations over Poland, etc., etc. And so the pitch which the Beaverbrook's Express is making is very much that Stalin's pal Churchill is the one who can deal with him effectively, whereas the sort of the Labour pitch is, well, Stalin's left wing, we're quite left wing, so we'll get on with him really well. And so off they go to Potsdam, and so there is this hiatus where they are both at this international conference negotiating with Stalin and Truman, and only one of them will in turn come back after polling day.
Yeah, that must have been quite shocking, I would have thought, for Stalin. And there's a famous exchange. Churchill had just introduced his science advisor, Lord Charwell, who we've discussed here before, the prof, as he called him. And he described him to Joseph as a man who acted Gestapo for him. And Stalin, who I think is actually very witty. There's lots of stuff where Stalin's very witty. He quickly responds, I thought it was only Mr. Attlee who had a Gestapo. And I think Stalin's wit is actually quite unsung.
Well, we can publish a little book called The Wit and Wisdom of Joseph Stalin. But also, of course, Stalin does take an interest in the outcome of the election. He asks Attlee what he thinks the result will going to be, and Attlee, being sort of modest, I suppose, but also, of course, genuinely not knowing the answer, says, well, I think it's going to be quite close. Then after the election, when Labour does win big and sort of Attlee comes back to Potsdam, Stalin says, but I thought you said it was going to be close, as though he had it within his control. It was all going to be fixed up in advance. So although certainly Stalin could be sharp, he seems to have genuinely not understood that British general elections were pretty free and fair, and that the outcome, especially after 10 years of not having had an election, was going to be.
But regardless of the political outcome of the election, a continuity did exist in terms of British foreign policy between Churchill's government and Attlee's because of the post-war realities imposed by the Soviet Union, forced Attlee and Churchill to come together, I think.
I think that's true, and the amount of continuity is significant. Churchill pretty much explicitly acknowledges this after the election, and that Attlee has been, of course, fully informed of pretty much everything that was going on in diplomatic negotiations with the Soviets during the war. He's largely taken the same approach as Churchill. It's difficult to say that there was any differences. And so you've got this situation where, although there is a bitter conflict over domestic policy, and there are certainly arguments about who's going to be more experienced at dealing with the Soviets, in substantive terms, there's not a great deal in it.
Yeah, no, I agree. And so amidst this, they had to return back to London for the actual counting of the election, the vote, the 26th of July. And how did it go?
Well, of course, the results are very good for Labour and very bad for the Conservatives. The polls have closed 3 weeks earlier, so sort of the actual counting can be started during the day. So the first results come at 10 a.m. And one of Churchill's aides, Captain Richard Pym, all the first 10 constituencies have gone Labour. And there's an 11.7% swing to Labour. There are key Conservatives like Harold Macmillan who lose their seats. The Liberal leader and good friend of Churchill, Archibald Sinclair, loses his seat. And so by that evening, the result is absolutely clear, and Churchill goes to the palace to tender his resignation to King George VI.
Right. I want to do a little thing for our political science quant nerds out there. And that is to say, by the end of the vote counting, Labour had 393 seats, which was a majority of 146. Conservatives had 213, which represented a loss of 190 seats. And I also think that swing that you talked about, Richard, which was an 11.7% swing in Labour's favor, was the largest political swing since the election of 1800. So this is, I want particularly our American audience to understand, this is catastrophic for so that evening when Churchill actually tendered in his resignation, Attlee afterwards came or contacted the king at 7:30 and to let him know that he had won the election, that he was going to accept. And the king said, I know, I've already heard it on the 6 o'clock news. So, I mean, the cat was out of the bag.
And so, I mean, the question is, how much of a surprise was this? Now, I would say the scale of the victory was a surprise, but I would also say that there had been predictions either of a narrow Labour victory or of the Liberals and Labour getting sufficient between them to form some coalition. And now when you get this huge landslide, then naturally everybody gasps. But what has got to be remembered is that I think that the Labour Party had a sense of being on an upward curve. They didn't necessarily think we're going to win, but there have been some gains at by-elections since then. And even a prediction of the Conservatives getting a 60 or 100 seat majority themselves, that still involved Labour gaining an awful lot of seats. The other point, which is also forgotten, is that the Liberals had been expected to do well because of the Beveridge report. William Beveridge, with his popular ideas about social reform, who was a Liberal and was campaigning prominently for the Liberals, he also loses his parliamentary seat in 1945, actually. So part of the shock is the Liberals only got 12 seats in 1945. Paradoxically, I'm going to say this is quite good news for the Conservatives in the long run, because you're quite right to say this is a catastrophic defeat. It's the worst one that the Conservatives have had since 1906. They were in a position where they could start to rebuild, which they do quite effectively over the next 6 years. And the fact that there isn't a strong Liberal Party that can rival means that they're the only realistic alternative government. And so if things go wrong for Labour, as they do to a considerable extent from 1947 onwards, it is the Tories who are the ones who are going to benefit.
Right. But I think in terms of the size, again, one of the things that I focus in that I always try to tell my friends in the States is that Labor did a fantastic job, I think, in the election, turning the Tory record, the Chamberlain positions, the Baldwin positions against the Tory party. And that this is really like, well, why would you trust the Tories? They failed to deliver homes for heroes in 1918 as a part of the government then in the First World War. But I also think one of the interesting issues here is that through that interwar period, Churchill himself, and as we said, the Conservatives went on Churchill's personal record. Churchill himself told you he was not a regular conservative. Chamberlainites, I'm not a Baldwin guy. They're getting it wrong. And that, in a way, allowed him to transcend regular party politics in Britain. But now that he's had to go back down to regular party politics in Britain, I don't think that he found a comfortable home with traditional Conservative Party. And you can see that when he's like, I don't have a message for them. He doesn't quite understand what the Conservative Party can offer. And I think that comes out in a speech that he said, which was his cottage home speech, where he tried Baldwin-esque light touch, appeal to domesticity, painting a bucolic, solid prosperity that was going to be in the future. And that would have fallen so deaf on people whose homes in London have bombed, who are living in ruins. And I think all of that is revealed in the fact that Labor is successful in showing how different they are from the Conservative Party. They're very much the party of the future by 1945. That's one of my holistic takeaways. You can use that in books. Just cite me.
Don't worry. You'll have your own special section in the bibliography. Okay, so let's talk about Churchill's reaction to defeat. There's this famous quotation where his wife, Clementine, says to him, thinking that now kind of be a good moment for him to go into dignified retirement, she says, well, maybe it's a blessing in disguise, to which he replies, in which case it's a very effective disguise. This was a hard psychological blow for him, which I really think does take some months to recover. I mean, he was taking holidays, and he does go off to northern Italy in September and does actually chill out a bit and I think recover psychologically. But he never actually considers giving up the leadership of the party. Within 1 or 2 days, he's made this announcement that he's going to carry on. And there are people like Anthony Eden who would quite like to be Conservative Party leader themselves, who are going, maybe you might like to think about, I can't say it.
I couldn't possibly.
and Churchill, actually, in 1947, I think it's 1940, they do sort of delegate the chief whip, key figure in the parliamentary party, to go and have a word with him and say that everybody thinks he should step down, and he just like, no, and that's the end of that, because his reputation is such that you can't be seen to push him out. I think he probably is still an asset to the Conservative Party, actually.
No, but he's such a figure that when the gray man comes to him and says, hey, you got to lay it down, he's like, no, I'm not doing that.
And there's a quotation, these desires amongst part of the party to get rid of him continue for years, and there's a quotation from 1949 which saying, well, the only way that anybody's going to get rid of him is if the number 11 bus, which kind of runs around Parliament Square, runs him over, basically. Otherwise, he's shiftable.
Well, and of course, at some point while they're in opposition, he and Anthony Eden do come to an arrangement, which of course doesn't really play out, but that they would have a mentor-protege relationship, and that should Churchill run a successful campaign again, which of course we know he does, 1951. He'd run the campaign and then he'd withdraw almost immediately, of course, which we know he doesn't, and he stays on until 1955 despite a massive stroke. Anthony Eden's always the man in waiting, always a bridesmaid, never a bride, and you feel bad for him, although he does become a bride, and that leads us to the Suez, which is a whole other episode.
And so years later, Churchill's son, Randolph, addressed the question of whether Churchill blamed himself for the 1945 election result and had seen himself now as a failure. And Randolph Churchill, who had been researching his father's life for the biography that he eventually wrote 2 volumes of, he said, "I reject this hypothesis. He was indeed grievously smitten by the result of the 1945 election, and it took him 4 or 5 months to re-establish his morale. But he certainly never for a moment lost confidence in his supreme war achievement. He knew that he would live in him. I am afraid that if he blamed anyone for the result, it was, for the moment, the British electorate. But he soon got over that." The voters had not rejected Churchill, the war leader.
They did reject the party he led and the world they felt it represented.
The result transformed British politics, paved the way for the welfare state, and became one of the defining elections of the 20th century.
Yet Churchill himself was not finished.
He would return to Downing Street 6 years later for one final premiership.
In our next series, we'll do a deep dive into one of Churchill's most important political relationships with Welsh wizard David Lloyd George.
Don't forget to like, review, and share the podcast. In the meantime,
KBO.